If you're planning a new garden or revamping an old one, the best way to start off is by picking a garden style. A garden style can be just one word. It can be a phrase, it could be a feeling, it could be a trend, or it can even be a philosophy. But once you know what you want to see and feel when you step out of your back door and look at your garden, you'll find it so much easier to choose garden furniture, hard landscaping and plants. It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. I've done a video with 12 essential garden styles, which I'll put in the description below. And it generated loads of comment and feedback from you. And so this video is the next 10 styles which you've suggested. So let's start with naturalistic or prairie style. This is probably one of the biggest style directions in gardening to emerge over the last decade. And mostly, I think, we associate it with really quite big gardens, such as the High Line in New York or the Hauser and Wirth Art Gallery in Somerset. But it does translate into smaller gardens. I went to interview Michael McCoy, who's a garden designer who really specialises in naturalistic planting. And he had done a naturalistic garden in about 3/4 of an acre. But his own garden, which has also got an area of naturalistic planting, that area was probably only about 100 foot by perhaps 30 foot. So that's a size that a lot of us might have. I don't think naturalistic or prairie planting would work in really tiny gardens. The keys to it are: choose plants that grow well in your area, plant them in large groups and repeat those groups. And don't think so much about flower colour, but about foliage and plant shape. In fact, it is a really colourful style, as you can see from this Australian garden by Antique Perennials. But that's because you have such big blocks of plants that whatever's out really has some impact, rather than having lots and lots of different plants dotted around the garden. There's relatively little hard landscaping with the naturalistic or prairie garden style. For example, you probably wouldn't have a lawn, and you might just have paths sort of winding naturally between the planting. And then they'd come to a clearing and there'd be furniture there, maybe seating, maybe a table. It's a look that really looks good with contemporary garden furniture, but you could have any kind of garden furniture you like. The next style is the eco-friendly garden. Now, you might think this overlaps with a wildlife garden or recycling garden or some of the other garden styles, but the thing about the eco-garden is it deals with it all as a whole. It takes everything into account. It can be quite a contemporary look. For example, the Eco-City garden at a Chelsea Flower Show a few years ago was a really smart garden that could be adapted to a balcony. But it can also have quite a sort of rustic, relaxed wildlife feel, like Anne Vincent's garden, which is a small town garden, maybe 80 feet long, 20 feet wide. But the main issue in both these gardens is, how do you use the resources? When you're choosing hard landscaping, what's going to cause the least impact on the environment? What can you do about water? In Anne Vincent's garden, they've rerouted the guttering and the rainwater now flows into a pond. How can you minimise your energy use? In the Eco-City garden, they have solar-powered lighting. What plants are actually going to benefit the environment most? What plants are going to create wildlife habitats or offer food or shelter for wildlife, or improve the air quality or soak up pollution? In the Eco-City garden, they'd specifically chosen plants that would be the best for air quality. And one of these, incidentally, is moss. There was lots of moss in this garden, and a moss lawn of 12 square metres can soak up more carbon dioxide than 275 mature trees. So really thinking about plant choices like that. Other things you might want to consider is a green roof for something like a shed or a bin store. And in terms of the furniture, you would always be wanting to look for responsibly sourced wood or possibly recycled furniture, which takes me on to the next category, which is the upcycled or recycled garden. The upcycled or recycled garden is really about using what you've got. You can use online auction sites like eBay, Freegal, FreeCycle, Facebook Marketplace, etc. to either source things like pavers or planks or garden furniture or pots, or if you're throwing things out, don't take them to landfill, use those online sites so that somebody else can use them. And very often, if you've got something like pavers which you're having taken away, you would have to pay a contractor to take those away and dispose of them. But if you put it on something like Freegal or FreeCycle, somebody will come up, pick them up, they'll reuse them again, you'll give them free and you won't pay anything and they won't pay anything. So thinking about using recycled or upcycled things can be a real money saver and just a nice thing to do. Once again, you can have a number of different styles within this look. So you can be quite vintage or quite oldie, or you can look quite contemporary. These are two show BBC Gardeners World live gardens, and one of them used lots of industrial second-hand things like scaffolding poles and scaffolding planks and old gas tanks, and the other one used a lot of old garden furniture and even used doors as fences. The next garden is the plant lover's garden, and this is where the plants come first. The plant lover probably hasn't got a lawn because that's taking up an area that they could plant. So it'll be paths winding between the planting. And of course the main thing will be to find that extra special, interesting plant that nobody else has got. And probably the best plant lover's garden I can think of is Stephen Ryan's. Stephen Ryan is a horticulturalist, and he's a plant grower, and he also is one half of the Horti-Culturalists YouTube channel. And that's a channel that really is all about finding absolutely the best plants so that your garden is just a little bit more interesting than the next door person's garden. And it's great fun, and it's full of really valuable plant information. So if you're a planty person, I definitely suggest checking it out. Stephen's garden, which is almost a sort of jungle of plants, nevertheless, it does visually tie in very well because the sheds and the house are all in the same kind of architecture, and there's quite a story to that, which I'll put in the description below in a video. And now, of course, there's the city or courtyard garden. This is one of the ones which was one of your comments, and someone said, well, what about the city or courtyard garden as a style? And to be honest, I don't think it's a particular style. I think it's the definition of a space. But I think it's worth considering when you're thinking about garden style, because it's so important to have a word or feeling or phrase that really sums up what you want from it. A city or courtyard garden is very small, and so you can see everything all at once. So if you want it to really pull together, it probably has to work with some kind of big idea. Once again, you can be quite rural about it. You can have lots of cottage garden flowers and a comfy little bench. Or you can have a really smart fireplace with fabulous evergreen planting, like in this city garden by Charlotte Rowe Garden Design. Another of your suggestions was the rock, mountain or alpine garden. And a couple of people said, well, in South Africa we have a South African mountain garden, or we have a Rocky Mountain garden in the States. Here in Britain we have the rock garden, which came to fruition in the Edwardian era. And originally it existed as part of a huge garden. In fact, it's such a good solution for anyone who's got a slope in their garden. I've got a video on rock garden style, which I'll put in the description below, but there are two keys to making it look good, and one of them is, if possible, use the rocks that are locally available. If you obviously live in Yorkshire, you've got these fabulous mountains and hills around, but if you live like I do in Kent, which is not known for its mountains, but nevertheless this garden at Doddington Place Gardens actually does use local Maidstone rock. You'll always have to choose quite drought tolerant plants for a rock garden because water just goes downhill. There's just no doubt about that. But once they're established, of course, they won't need watering. Woodland garden style is the next one. Many ground gardens have got a woodland area, but once again, you really can adapt this to a smaller garden. If you've got a long, thin garden and you've got some trees at the end, that's a woodland area. And of course, now that we all realise how important it is to maintain trees, particularly in towns and cities, you could actually have quite small gardens with a woodland garden theme. If you've got established trees, it's quite a good idea to actually keep them unless there's something dangerous or really inappropriate about them, because it takes a tree a long time to come to maturity, and a mature tree is so valuable for the environment. However, if you're thinking of planting trees, do try to find out what native trees are in your area and plant those, because ultimately native trees are always much more valuable to wildlife. Woodland garden is another one where you won't want to have straight paths and smart areas. It will tend to be curves, it'll tend to be winding between the trees, much more natural feel. And of course you may well want to go for wooden garden furniture, although it's always a good idea to check that it comes from a reliable and responsible source. The other element that's really important to think of in a woodland garden is that it has layers. Literally the top layer are the trees, the layer underneath is the shrubs, and below that you've got the ground cover. And that's the way a forest or wood naturally works. So that brings me on to the native plants garden. Once again, this doesn't actually have to be a garden style as such. However, if you start getting interested in your native plants, you will start looking at the natural landscape where they grow. And very often, particularly if you live in a rural area or your town is quite close to the countryside, you'll want to start reflecting that style in the style of your garden. But you don't have to. You can actually grow native plants within almost any other garden style. I visited the Heronswood Garden at the Diggers Club, and that was originally designed as an English cottage garden style, but it's on the Australian Mornington Peninsula. And the head gardener, Bill Bampton, actually plants it up with as many native plants as he can, while keeping to that English cottage garden feel. So you can adapt native plants to anything that you like. I spoke to the senior wildlife expert at the RHS, Helen Bostock, about native plants and how important it was to have them in our borders. And they've done quite a lot of studies at the RHS, and what they came out with was that native plants will always be more beneficial to your wildlife than imported plants. However, sometimes some other plants from other parts of the world can be extremely useful because they may flower earlier or later and extend the flowering season, and also sometimes wildlife will adapt to a particular plant. So don't feel you always have to have native plants in your garden, but it is a good idea to increase the number of native plants you grow. Another of your suggestions was the rustic garden. Now, a rustic garden is not the same as a country garden. One of you in the comments described the rustic garden as with a big old tree and lots of farm implements hanging around as ornaments. And I sort of think that's a wonderful vision. For example, this very stylish garden belonging to garden writer Francine Raymond reuses wonderful agricultural troughs and feeders as planters and uses old sinks and tanks. So the idea is you're using some of the agricultural stuff that maybe just lies around a farmyard. And then, of course, we've got the edible garden, food forest, potager, that whole area of growing vegetables. Now, until recently, the vegetable garden was sort of tucked out of sight. It was just somewhere that you wouldn't see it. But I think we're really beginning to realise that A, vegetables are beautiful, and B, combining vegetables and flowers is frightfully good because it attracts the bees and the pollinators. So a food forest is a way of growing plants that is much more in tune with nature than agriculture. So it's the idea is that you use trees for their nuts and berries and shrubs for their nuts and berries, and then you have ground cover, you have vines, you have perennials, you have mushrooms, and it all works together, and also that you're not actually cutting everything down, harvesting it and then replanting it. So that's the idea of a food forest, and I think that it adapts to a small garden really quite well. There's also a surprising number of flowers that actually you can eat. For example, every part of the daylily is used in Chinese cookery. However, of course, a daylily is not a lily. A lily is actually very poisonous. So before you go into which flowers you can eat and which flowers you can't eat, you really have to do the research. And I know some people get very cross in the gardening world when they see Instagrammers putting completely poisonous flowers on top of their food and then photographing it. Now, one thing you really need to see if you're thinking about choosing a garden style is my original video, the 12 garden styles, and that's up there, so don't miss it. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.